because there really should be a national monument dedicated to Gene Kelly's ass. Hey y'all, my name is Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today, and for this video, I'm going to be doing my feminist reading vlog. Alright, before you get into anything bookish, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, as well as tell me in the comments what's the last book that you read that had some feminist themes. Add to my TBR. Why not? Alright, so this is like my 4th year, I think, of doing this. To celebrate Women's Empowerment Day, I do a reading vlog of books with feminist themes. I used to do some fiction and nonfiction, but nowadays it really does just tend to stick with the nonfiction side, especially because my TBR around feminist topics has really expanded. So this time around, I'm going to be reading 3 books, and as you can see, I am currently in the middle of one of them. Starting at the top, The Geek Feminist Revolution by Cameron Hurley. The title of this one alone was enough for me to add it to my TBR. I went into it really hopeful that the author was going to be talking about misogyny in geek circles, especially fandom circles, because unfortunately that is still quite prominent. And while it did fulfill that slightly, it also has a memoir feel to the story where the author is talking about her own experiences, not only as a woman, not only as a geek, but also as a writer. Next up is one that's very comparable to one of the books I read for last year's video, Women and Other Monsters by Jess Zimmerman. Again, title alone on this one was enough for me to add it to my TBR, but also this really gorgeous cover. Definitely was making me think of Natalie Haynes's Divine Might / Pandora's Jar, but also unlikable female characters. In this, Zimmerman is discussing themes that can be tied into monsters from folklore and mythology who are often presented as women, and that the idea of women who don't fit this idealistic standard makes them somehow monstrous. Yeah, I was really excited going into it. And then finally is She Found It at the Movies, Women Writers on Sex, Desire, and Cinema, edited by Christina Newland. So this is a collection of essays done by different authors, and it's looking at cinema through the female perspective and how it is still a very unusual view, unfortunately, and the real-life topics and politics that tie into this. Seeing as how I've done a lot of research around the influence that we have on media and that media has on us, of course, this one was right up my alley. From the back, I am already predicting that I will be enjoying this, because Timothée Chalamet's eyes gleam with the light of 1,000 suns, because you'd let Zoe Kravitz get away with putting gum in your hair, and because there really should be a national monument dedicated to Gene Kelly's ass. Oh yeah, this definitely sounds like it's gonna be fun. So on that note, roll the vlog. Hey guys, so I have officially started into the Geek Feminist Revolution. I am liking this so far, but I do think the title is a little bit misleading. So the author breaks down this book into different parts, and I was initially thinking like each part was going to be certain pieces of media, certain fandom cultures. Right out of the get-go, the first one is purely dedicated to writing and her job as a writer, not just as an author, but also the copywriter. And while she does talk about prejudice in writing circles, the misogyny in writing circles, it feels like the main focus behind those chapters isn't about the feminism, it's more about her experience writing, telling us what she's learned in her years as an author. That's not a bad thing, and like it is interesting. There were a few good quotes here and there that I did enjoy. This just didn't really match with what I went into this book expecting based on the title. I will say I do appreciate how she continuously brings things back to feminism as a main core value for her, and I also really appreciate the fact that she acknowledges intersectional feminism and critiques the aspect of feminism that is not open to all women. Thankfully, after that portion, I then jumped into part 2, where it does seem as though it's going to be more what I was expecting from this book. Each chapter thus far has focused on one piece of media, though I will admit the media she's chosen thus far are not ones I was expecting. So for example, in the first chapter of the second part, she has Some Men Are More Monstrous Than Others on True Detectives, Men and Monsters, which was a TV show that featured Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson. I've never actually seen it, but I've heard what it's about. And I feel like off that chapter in particular, I would love to kind of talk to Hurley about her thoughts when it comes to unlikable female characters, because she mentions how we start to empathize with these male characters who are fighting monsters, but in the face of doing all of these monstrous acts in their everyday lives. And she explains how the women characters of the show end up getting left behind and forgotten about. Female characters end up not really being looked at as people because the experiences they have aren't the focus of the story. They don't matter. Even though in the show, they are oftentimes the victim of
both the monsters that are the villains and also the monsters that are the protagonists. So I did think that was really interesting. I was very, very surprised to see that the next chapter was focused on Die Hard, of all things. Now, I definitely enjoy the movie Die Hard, but I can't really say I've ever looked at it with like analyzing glasses on. And I did appreciate how she admits from the get-go that like she watches it a couple times of the year. It's one of the best written films out there. And she ties it to her dislike of pinups. The photos, the pieces that used to be, you know, made for marketing, but are now very clearly like not for that. And she kind of just dives into how this tiny moment in that movie reinforces the idea of women as, you know, commodities, products, us being sexual objects. I mean, it is a discussion that's been done time and time again. It was just very interesting to look at it through this particular lens, so I did like that. So this part right now that I'm in is what I went into this book expecting. This is what I wanted from the book. Here's hoping, though, that at the very least, I do really enjoy everything the author talks about with this specific part. Hey guys! So I've read a little bit further into the geek feminist revolution, and just as I anticipated, the further into this chapter I got, the more of what I was wanting from the book became the focus. And given the fact that these are pretty short chapters, yeah, I already have like a good few more annotations. I had a good few more lines that I underlined and really enjoyed. Where I left off with y'all was Mad Max and the people economy of the universe. First off, Hurley starts out by just kind of talking about the inherent politicalness of stories in the first place. Feels very apt for when I'm filming this. This one, she kind of focuses on the commodification of women's bodies, but also how sexism is really just about power, and you can really see the importance of production in sexism with how it's presented in Mad Max, because the person who's kind of the most powerful is the one who has, you know, taken all these women to be chattel essentially and nothing but milk and child producers. So that one was definitely a really good chapter overall, and I'm actually really intrigued to go try and watch this movie now. I've never really had much interest in it previously, but now, yeah, I kind of want to watch it. Next one was one that I thought was very interesting because she talked about the hero archetype and how a lot of times the term hero is so often tied towards male heroes, and that's why they have to specify when it comes to female heroes, or saying heroine over hero. She also went into when creating heroes, a lot of times they become a hero off of something terrible that has happened to someone in their life, and a lot of times that ends up being a woman, or if it's a female character, a lot of the times she ends up becoming the hero of her own story because of something terrible that's happened to her. They aren't just inherently becoming heroes to be a good person sort of thing. I do think that's one aspect of storytelling that we have started to become more critical of. I mean, 2 years ago, I didn't know what fridging a female character meant, but that's also a trope and a trend that I've been paying more attention to and noticing how we're pushing against that, and also pushing against the victimhood of female characters, kind of playing into the female rage trope that's so popular. I think that's one aspect that tends to get tied into it, is, you know, the revenge story, but there are some stories that are getting popular now where we're just seeing the female rage, and it's not because of something as specific of that. And a line I really enjoyed in this chapter about female heroes that kind of ties into the next chapter about sexuality representation was, there's no legitimate reason that the stories we create, these stories we read, cannot include a true representation of the makeup of the actual world around us. I thought that was a great line. And like I said, the next one kind of tied into sexuality and how in stories you can shift what is considered the normal, and that helps to shift the normal for people's everyday lives. And I really enjoyed that because it kind of ties into cultivation theory, which was something that I focused on for my thesis in college. Cultivation theory focused on television, but media in general can lead to a particular set of beliefs and influence society on the whole by representing something in the stories they're ingesting. That wasn't the word I wanted. In the stories they're consuming. There we go. That's something I do think we are getting better about in our stories. And of course, there's always room for improvement, but we are starting to normalize seeing sexualities that aren't just hetero in stories more so. And we're starting to see a wider variety of characters who have other sexualities. I mean, not every gay character falls into like the stereotypical gay best friend role anymore. And lesbian characters don't all fall into this like overtly butch masculine role either. The final chapter I read so far was talking about strong female protagonists and how a lot of times they get showcased in this way that is so tied to being asexual being as well. They ride that line of being masculine and that they can protect themselves, but also still highlighting their femininity, because a lot of those characters originally were created for male consumption. Honestly, this was a pretty short chapter, but I actually would love to look at more analysis of this idea. Another one that I think we're getting better about as a society, I mean, one of the biggest examples she listed was Buffy, but even with that TV show, I think eventually the writers started to push against that showcasing of Buffy. So yeah, I would love to read more about that one. And then the next chapter is on unlikable women, which of course I can't wait for. I'm a little nervous that, like, seeing as how each of these are really short chapters and we're kind of just kicking through them really fast, that the rest of the book isn't going to fall into that same sort of analysis. I'm so nervous to see what the rest of this book is going to be like.
Hey guys, so I have officially finished out the Geek Feminist Revolution, and I had very mixed feelings on this in the end, honestly. 𝗖cie herself is a good author. I think she's a good writer because the way she would present some of these topics was really well done. Some of the lines she would do to encompass the topic were definitely fantastic and tab-worthy, and like I'm probably going to try and remember them to use them myself in the future, but I don't feel like any of the topics she presented were new to me. I'll also say again, I just thought there would be more of a discussion around like fandoms and like geek culture and feminism within those. There were also a good few times where I felt like this book almost read like advertising for some of 𝗖cie's fiction work. I'm not going to necessarily knock it for that because obviously 𝗖cie's going to know her own work inside and out, so it's very easy to point to it as examples. Also, the way she talked about it did intrigue me enough to add it to my TBR. Since the book is broken down into different parts, the parts that I did enjoy the most were geek. In fact, flipping back through this, I realized majority of the ones I enjoyed the most came from that section. A specific chapter I don't think I discussed previously was Where Have All the Women Gone? Reclaiming the Future of Fiction. And in this one, she specifically dives into female authors and the issues they have to deal with under the fantasy sci-fi genre. Claims they didn't actually write their own work. She might have written it, but she only wrote the one. Like, she never wrote anything else similar to it. Or one that I definitely enjoyed because I do see a lot of this. She wrote it, but like it's not considered really art. And then another I really enjoyed, she wrote it, but she's an anomaly. She's unusual. Most women don't do this. And in that one particular, she had this piece of evidence that I thought was really interesting. When women make up just 30% of a group, men and women alike believe that there are an equal number of men and women in the room. At 50% women, a figure we see so little in media representation that it appears anomalous, we believe that women actually outnumber the men in the group. The next part of the book really does focus on 𝗖cie herself. It's called Let's Get Personal, and so a lot of it does come from her own experiences. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, just not really what I expected. So it wasn't really surprising that I tended to enjoy the sections the most where she was talking about her time in the sci-fi fantasy community. And like I said, 𝗖cie herself is a good author. There were many quotes throughout this section that I did still very much enjoy, and I probably will end up pointing back to. For example, when she was talking about representation. So if you find yourself wondering why so many of us ask to be included now and put ourselves and others into stories we've been written out of, perhaps first you might ask why that inclusion is considered political, but the erasure was not. The laws, the asylums, the housing policies, the repression, and the abuse. There's nothing more political than erasure, the unseeing. So in the end, I did enjoy this book, and it is unfortunately one of the situations where my expectations kind of hindered my enjoyment. When I finished this, initially I was like a 3.5 star. However, after the fact, looking back on it, reading through some of the tabs I marked, I actually do think this is a 4-star read. Maybe not quite a new favorite, but I did walk away with some really good nuggets.
Hey guys, so I have officially started into my next book for this reading vlog, Women and Other Monsters by 𝗖cie 𝗰𝗁. Okay, like from the start, I was a little hesitant just because when the author introduces this, she makes a point of mentioning that she's not a classicist, which isn't inherently a problem, but I don't know, with this sort of a setup, I kind of figured she would be. However, she is a big mythology fan. And like, I can relate to that. And thus far, I do feel like when it comes to tying things in from these stories to the actual works, it seems like she has at least done a fair amount of research into it. There are also a good few quotes that I've had to tab. I have actually had a good few tabs through this so far, and I am really liking the basic idea of it, where she's just talking about female monsters from folklore and mythologies that, you know, have a large basis on a lot of media nowadays, and how the presentation of those characters tied into misogyny and how the viewing of these characters through a feminist light can kind of change the perception of them. I even appreciated the fact that from the start she makes a point of talking about how initially at the time these characters were showcased in a really monstrous way, but creatures conceived as repulsive were gradually reimagined as appealing, even seductive, at least on the surface. The later monsters don't just look more beautiful and more feminine, they look more human, underscoring the idea that monstrousness is somehow the human woman's natural condition. I thought that was a very interesting take, and it's making me really intrigued to kind of think in this way about some of these female villains, rounding out the introduction chapter and kind of talking about what the actual focus of the book moving forward is going to be. Monsters exist in opposition to normality. If the expectations are too narrow, nearly anything can become monstrous. And that was just in the introduction chapter. I think you can tell I have been enjoying this thus far. I do also appreciate the fact that there's art to go along with each of the chapters. So obviously the first one is focused on Medusa. Early on in the chapter, Zimmerman comes out with this banger line: "An unbeautiful woman is an unfulfilled promise to the world." And then a great line tying into Medusa's story, especially if you know the full extent of it. That is the double-edged sword of female beauty. Those who fail at it are less than human, but those who succeed are punished and shamed. And from there on, Zimmerman has this ongoing idea in that chapter, embracing the ugliness of who you are. And the strive for the beauty ideal is literally impossible. The author does kind of start to go into some of her own anecdotal pieces. So this does have a few moments here and there where it does feel a little bit more of a memoir, less of an analysis, but I think she's mixing them together pretty well. I mean, yeah, so that first chapter, I think Zimmerman really came in strong there. Like I said, I was a little nervous at the start, but since then, I'm way more into it. Like, these are definitely broad strokes, but I think it's interesting to talk about this sort of stuff through the viewpoint of these female monsters from mythologies, from folklore. Yes, I would love if there was a little bit more of an analytical view of these characters true to like the stories, maybe a la like what Natalie Haynes does. But at the same time, at the start, Zimmerman admitted like that is not what this book is going to be. So I can't fault her for not giving me that, but I would also love that. Basically, it would have been really perfect if I read Pandora's Jar alongside this. I think reading these two together would be really interesting.
Hey y'all, so I have continued reading Women and Other Monsters. I'm actually about at the halfway point now. I am continuing to really enjoy this, but I will say that I do wish Zimmerman was kind of diving into things a little bit deeper. I wish she was expanding on each of the monsters a little bit. Even though I personally already know a good deal about them, I think it would be interesting if she would kind of expand on aspects of the monsters that tie into the points she's discussing. But even with some of the issues she is bringing up, it does also feel like a lot of the topics and the evidence she's using is very anecdotal. It does have a sort of memoir feel as well. I do appreciate it more when she uses like fact-based evidence or will reference studies. For example, in the chapter on 𝗖cie, she discusses anatomical Venuses, which I will say I didn't know what those were, so that was very interesting. And there was actually a passage in here that I thought would be really interesting if looking at it with the view of like horror stories or horror movies. And so it kind of got me thinking about the Beware the Monster, I think it is, by Anna Bogotiskaya. And I loved Unlikable Female Characters by that author. I'm wanting to read that new book from her. And then I just recently added Men, Women, and Chainsaws to my TBR because that one also kind of discusses feminist themes in horror stories. I'm very intrigued about both of those. But the line specifically that made me think about that was, even the ubiquitous images of stylized violence against women, which echo the Venus in their juxtaposition of beauty and gore, are intended to position the body as a pristine canvas on which passion is enacted, sexual passion or violent passion, but anyway, the passion of a man. Tying back to 𝗖cie and kind of continuing with that horrific element of his story, she actually talks about Ovid's version of the story, where what inspires fear in it is the sheer alienness of her body, now so unfamiliar that she wants to flee. What inspires true horror is the fact that she can't. And while I love that line and I appreciate the discussion that comes off of it, I think Zimmerman actually kind of missed an opportunity to expand upon that when it comes to like puberty, for example. A person grows older and their body changes. Eventually they don't start to recognize their body as their own anymore because of the changes that they literally cannot prevent. Or going off of that, looking at like body dysmorphia and maybe tying that into gender dysmorphia. The next chapter went into the sirens, and I definitely felt like there was a lot of tie-ins between between that chapter and then some of the chapters from unlikable female characters, specifically in the discussion around seduction and how it's seen as women's only weapon, our purpose, the thing that makes us real, but it also makes us a lie. And then in that chapter, she expands upon her own sexual identity, which I did think was interesting. Again, feel like I would have enjoyed it more if she would have taken that aspect, pulled it away from her personal experience, and instead had maybe expanded upon like the prejudice towards sapphic relationships that still exists. She also did bring up sexual freedom and slut shaming in that chapter. That said, though, I did appreciate this one line, and this definitely got me thinking. It's difficult, maybe even impossible, for us to imagine an understanding of women's seductiveness untouched by the male gaze, which is to say, not only the appraising looks of actual men, but the patriarchal pentacon that judges women's bodies according to some Baroque standard of feminine appeal. Like, yeah, that definitely got me thinking. I know I do it. I know other women who have said it, where it's like, I do this thing because I like it. It makes me feel good about myself. But let's be real here. If the patriarchy wasn't around to be telling us to do these things, would we still do them? If the patriarchy never existed to tell us we needed to shave our legs, would we still shave our legs? Also, I gotta say, did I point out these gorgeous art pieces that go along with each chapter? Yeah, I'm censoring this one for YouTube, but come on, like, this is beautiful. I love this. So the Harpy chapter specifically was talking about women and ambition, reaching above our station, but also like how we put ourselves down, how we're less likely to reach above our station. I remember at like a women in business conference, how if there's a list of 10 things that are required, women are less likely to apply if they don't complete all 10 of those things, whereas majority of men would still apply even if they only fulfilled 4 of those 10 things. I am really enjoying this. I wish this book was like 200 pages longer.
Hello, friends. It is Nat here with the late night update, which is why I am barefaced. I also have a nice glass of wine. I officially finished out Women and Other Monsters by 𝗖cie 𝗰𝘁. I really like what is here. At the end of every chapter, I kept having the feeling like I wasn't satisfied because I wanted Zimmerman to dive even deeper into the topics she was exploring. I wanted her to dive even deeper into the connections between these topics and the monsters she is discussing in each of them. I also will say I don't love the fact that it isn't stated right out of the get-go that the monsters in this book are all Greek-based. That's cool. I mean, obviously, I love Greek mythology. I'm so here for that. But it says the folklore that has shaped our dominant culture teems with frightening female creatures. While yes, I do think that does describe Greek mythology, especially because I feel like it is a mythological group that is very popular, thanks in part to, Rick Riordan. But there are plenty of other cultures that are getting bigger and more well known out there. Their mythologies and their folklore are becoming more widespread, also thanks to Rick Riordan. Love Uncle Rick for that. So I don't really understand why it wasn't stated like right on the tin that the focus of this book is going to be around Greek mythology. Let's actually talk about my more in-depth thoughts when it comes to the last few chapters of this book. And once again, I do just want to show off the art for this chapter. Really, the illustrator, Samira Ingold, outdid herself. I think she did a great job with all of these. So the main focus with the chapter on the Sphinx is really talking about knowledge, the knowledge that women have that is different from men, how us having this knowledge allows us to be more powerful. But also along with that in this chapter, something I did really enjoy was kind of how she tied things into like stories and how these start to impact us and influence our worldviews. Obviously, of course, I love this because it dives again into cultivation theory, which in this chapter, along with other chapters, she does draw from some of her own experiences. Without getting into too many specifics, I really liked this one paragraph. It's easy to get stuck in that story. It's the story that has a space for you, the story that welcomes you in. To escape it means turning the whole world upside down. The girl is supposed to be young and tactile, eager to please and easily led. The monster isn't supposed to know more than the hero. This is how stories work. Next one was focusing on the Furies. Again, I just gotta appreciate this art. It is beautiful. I will say overall for the chapter, I actually really enjoyed this one. I think it's probably my favorite chapter, mostly focusing around women's anger and the perception around an angry woman. I do think that would have been a great opportunity to kind of discuss how race plays into that as well, like the stereotype of the angry Black woman or the like quote spicy Latina, and kind of explore those stereotypes. But overall, I did really appreciate she tied in factual evidence. She tied in some of her own experiences. She tied in a lot of examples
from modern events, which is very depressing given the fact that this book is on the newer side. She even went so far to cite a study that actually discusses the negative effects that anger has on a woman's health. And that's just like totally crazy. Even if they're like very small, relatively insignificant effects in the grand scheme of your life, the fact that harboring so much anger can literally increase your blood pressure to the point that it can affect your health is insane. We had a chapter that was especially interesting to me because it covered a monster that I actually have not seen many times, but it was 𝗖cie, and she mentions how there are always some version in every folklore, in every mythology, in every culture, there is some form of this monster, a woman who takes children. And so with this chapter, naturally, it talks about motherhood, having children, not having children, wanting to have kids, not being able to have kids, not wanting to have kids. Unsurprisingly, of course, women's choice comes up in this. And I once again think that Zimmerman did a great job of tying in current events to this topic. Like myself, I think if you agree with her, then this chapter overall is probably just going to fire you up like it did me. I really appreciate that she discussed the expectations for women because of this ability. Another chapter where I didn't feel like anything new was really covered here. I can't help myself. I did get very passionate about it. And I did really enjoy the anecdotal evidence she wove into this one again, because she actually tells this great story about her grandmother that I thought was wonderful. But at the same time, I did spend majority of this chapter rather pissed off. And that's not because of the writing. It's because of the circumstances that we are currently living in. And so going off that, I think that was actually a great chapter to be followed by the next one around the Hydra and how women are separated in so many different ways. How so often we are told that we need to hate each other, and here's all these ways to segment us. But the thing we always need to think about is who benefits from us being segmented, from us being separated, from us being at odds with each other. And so I really enjoyed that one again. I will say I also feel like overall Zimmerman did a fairly decent job of including intersectional feminism when it was really necessary and integral to the points she was making, so brava for that. The one section I did want to bring attention to was the recognition that our lives are far from identical is part of the project. It allows us to step in where others are cut down or bashed in or weak. Our task is not to share a heart, but to share a goal, where the goal is liberation. Our great strength, if we can use it, is that we cannot be completely destroyed. That whatever angle we're attacked from, there will always be more of us, riled up and righteous and coming back twice as hard. So she tied it back to the Hydra very well there. Like I said, I did really enjoy this book. I also wish it was 200 pages longer. My rating for this is going to be a 4 stars. I think this was a really good read. I definitely think it's more of a introductory read. There were definitely things I would change about it, but I would highly recommend this if you have an interest in Greek mythology and you want to start reading into feminist discussions and modern day issues. Like I still would highly recommend this book. It's just not quite the 5-star I went into it wanting, but even still a really solid read. I mean, this was really good.
This is a very late update. I probably shouldn't be filming this, but I am rushing to try and get this video finished. I am reading She Found Out the Movies. I am really liking it. I just put off starting it for way too long. I have now worked through the first section, which is purely focused on innocence and experience. And so it kind of talks about how each of these women started to view sex and sexuality through the movies they consumed growing up and the impact that had on them. There's been some really interesting ones. I loved the one about Rizzo from Greece, especially because I always thought Rizzo was the best. And looking back now, I definitely think part of that is because she is so owning of her sexuality. And then there was one about Set It Off that I actually really liked, and I would love to kind of pick this specific author's brain. Karina Antrobus, she was specifically discussing the role of Black women in a lot of media from the 90s, often utilized as basically just decoration pieces, and also kind of going off of that, the stereotype of hypersexualization of Black women, how there already is such a limited view of women receiving pleasure in media, let alone Black women. Black women's stories are still so
underrepresented in Hollywood. I also really enjoyed one about Marlene Dietrich and kind of discussing androgyny. Another one that I definitely think could have been expanded upon to kind of discuss drag, but obviously these are supposed to be just short, quick little essays, but how that one in particular allowed for the author Lauren Vevers to kind of accept the gender expression she wanted to put on. How if she wanted to be more masculine presenting, like that was okay and she could still be sexy in that way. One that I'm really sad to say I didn't particularly like, but I think it really just comes down to this author's writing style. It seems this author definitely likes to use unusual terms, a little reminiscent of like Cassandra Khaw, where I feel like I need a thesaurus to read what this person is saying. I can work through it, but at the same time, it's the first page is like a really big word salad. But it basically boiled down to her very complicated feelings that she associated sexual interest with characters that are viewed in a very villainous light. So like she talked about Psycho, A Clockwork Orange, what were some of the other ones? Oh, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and kind of the juxtaposition of like having sexual interests that may not seem feminist on the surface. Definitely kind of going into like BDSM elements, because she talks about how she went to a presentation that was done by a dominatrix and finally getting to realize the people who were wanting to be dominated were ones who in their everyday lives had a lot of responsibility, a lot of power. This is a topic I do find very interesting, but the way it was presented isn't really done in a new way. Like this is very surface level, and like I said, I also just didn't really like this author's writing style, so unfortunately that one didn't go super great for me. And then finally this last one was a woman who unfortunately did not realize she was a lesbian because her focus became so obsessed on having men want her and having approval from men, because she grew up watching movies from the 50s where the women characters were all about being beautiful and glamorous, and the end goal was to win the man. I really like this chapter. Had I worked out my sexuality earlier, I'd have realized that I was objectifying those women just as much as any man. The silver screen shone so brightly that I couldn't see past its outdated notion that women exist for male ownership. I was so caught up in cinematic beauty and the version of life that it peddled that I failed to see what was under my nose all along. This chapter in particular, like, wow, really good. So we've got fantasy and danger, followed by our bodies, ourselves, and then the female gaze. So yeah, I definitely am liking this one, but kind of similar to Women and Other Monsters. Like, I'm just not 100% satisfied by the essays, and it's because they're so short that I want some of them to be expanded upon. I would love to read more about these topics, and I would love to hear more from these authors. So I think this is definitely like a great way to like gain somebody's interests in these authors' works or in these topics, kind of introduce you to them in a different light. And I'm hopeful that I will maybe finish it in time for this video. That is very hopeful.
Good morning, friends. So we are doing a last minute, like really last minute, like if you're watching this the day it came out, I filmed this that morning. So we're doing a really last minute update. I unfortunately still have not finished She Found It at the Movies. I have officially surpassed the halfway point now. I am enjoying this, but I think it's definitely like a mixed bag situation where obviously I vibe better with some writing styles and some topics work for me a lot more than others. That was already the case with the first section of the book. So I've now finished out this second section, which was about fantasy and danger, and now I've started into our bodies, ourselves. Kind of continuing on with my favorites of fantasy and danger, I really loved the Death Cults and Matinee Idols by Pamela Hutchinson. That one specifically talked about different big name movie stars who were like the heartthrobs of their time. And whenever they ended up passing early, the grief that could be seen among all of these young women. Obviously, one of the first examples was James Dean. That one makes perfect sense. I've always heard about that one. The one that the author spoke of from her own experience was River Phoenix. That was before my time, but I do know about it. Like, I've absorbed that culturally. And then after that one was Heath Ledger. That one I do get a little bit more. And I really liked how she kept bringing it back to like the importance of it being these young women who are mourning over these men. Whenever Heath Ledger passed, all of the focus was really on his most recent like big name guy movie, The Dark Knight, which like don't get me wrong, I'm a comic book person. I think Ledger did a phenomenal job in playing Joker in that. But of course, when I think of Heath Ledger, the first movie that comes to mind is 10 Things I Hate About You. One line I really enjoyed was, "If lusting after stars is a fantasy we comfort ourselves with, these early deaths teach us that our dream lives can be just as messy and disappointing as reality." And then once again, I really liked how she talked about this situation is so unique, but it sort of allows some young women to experience grief in a way that's still sort of separate from them. It definitely plays into like parasocial relationships. This one particular paragraph kind of dived into that. It's certainly true that it is helpful for a young person to be acquainted with death before it really hits them. We continue to perform this grief, to practice mourning in a safe space, far away from our real loved ones. Mourning becomes about homage to rather than loss, a sign of respect for the actor's talent, his always unattainable beauty. I think about all those sneers in the newspaper, and I wonder why male journalists felt the need to belittle this grief. So yeah, I really like that chapter, and this is another one where like I think it would be fascinating to kind of deep dive those situations. Definitely really enjoyed that chapter. The last one I have read, and the last one I did really like, was in the next section, Our Bodies, Ourselves, and it is called Dry by Willow McClay. The author was born intersex, and so she has an interesting perspective of female desire in movies. Even though she may be able to connect on it mentally, she can't do so physically. Her body is always going to be a separator from the experiences she watches in cinema. Cinema has historically had little space for minority persons, and that's even more true when it comes to things like sex. In the movies, a man is more likely to vomit than to come when seeing a body that looks like mine, and I internalize that feeling. And she goes on to talk about how often a situation like that is used as this sort of plot twist, this like trap, and for a long time that was really the only representation of women who had bodies similar to hers. But I did think it was really interesting that the one movie she could actually truly connect with was a movie about a alien that inhabits the body of a woman, and it's called Under the Skin, featuring Scarlett Johansson. I've heard of it, I've never actually seen it, and how this alien attempts to live a normal human life, but because of the differences in their biology, they can't do that. Overall, I think it was a really well written chapter. It has a real emotional punch, and again, this is one that I would love to expand upon, pick this author's brain when it comes to other movies, other pieces of media where they may not necessarily have representation the same as her own, but what movies was she able to see herself in through these metaphors, through these situations. As I said before, I do think it kind of comes down to whether or not I work with the author's writing, whether I really can connect with the topic they're discussing, or some of them I just feel like they're very tied up in their own anecdotal evidence. They don't really explore deeper, they don't really have a broader range to discuss there. But for the ones that I am really liking, so good. I am still on the newer side when it comes to reading about film analysis, but in the introduction chapter, they did talk about Laura Mulvey, who wrote Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, and I've since looked her up, and she is very much known as a feminist cinema scholar, and so, of course, I am going to be adding her stuff to my TBR and reading more stuff off of that, and looking for recommendations going off of her work. So I haven't quite finished it yet, and I can already tell this is going to be one of those books that's very difficult to rate because I have had such a mixed bag with the different chapters. And this is also kind of a great explanation as to why I don't really read short story collections. But thus far, I'm going to estimate like probably a 4-star, maybe a 3.5 if it's really going to depend on how this like last section of the book is going to round out. But I guess stick around for my March wrap up later this month, and I will give you all a final review and a final rating there. Overall, I would say this was a pretty good feminist reading vlog this year, which is great. I'm so glad for that. I didn't have any DNFs. And even though I think every one of these books did kind of leave me wanting a little bit of something, at the very least they were really interesting and is showcasing to me that this is a section of books I really do need to spend more time finding ones that interest me and actually giving myself time to read them. But overall, I'd say this went pretty well. So on that note, thank you so much for going to my channel today, y'all. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, leave me some sort of a pink emoji in the comments. I have all my socials as well as a few ways you can support me, including my Patreon, linked in the description. I come out videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you. Bye.